Julian Assange has spent 4 full years now, as of this week, in a high-security prison in the United Kingdom called Belmarsh, which in 2004 the BBC dubbed proudly the British Guantanamo Bay. It is a prison known for being notoriously harsh. It houses the worst violent criminals as well as terror suspects. And Assange, for no good reason whatsoever, has been kept in that prison for 4 straight years, even though the only crime of which he has ever been convicted is a misdemeanor bail jumping charge stemming from his seeking asylum from Ecuador back in 2012. And yet, it was on April 12th, 2019, so 4 years ago and 2 days to this day, that Assange was arrested by British law enforcement agents who went into the Ecuadorian embassy and dragged him out. There you see the video on the screen. Brought him to Belmarsh prison, where he has been held ever since. The humanitarian aspect of the story is well known. He married his longtime girlfriend while in prison and had 2 young children with her who he has not been able to raise with her. And doctors, both for his mental health and his physical health, have warned that his health has been gravely degraded over the past 4 years. And there's a good likelihood that if he continues to be in prison, he will break and possibly even die. Prior to the 4 years that Assange has spent in this British prison, he has basically been detained for 7 years prior to that, going all the way back to 2012, when he sought asylum from Ecuador and went to the Ecuadorian embassy where he was granted asylum because Sweden was trying to force him to travel to that country, where 2 women had claimed that he had sexually assaulted them. 2 women whom he had dated for several months, who never made those allegations, and then suddenly united and both claimed that he had been sexually assaulted. Sweden was seeking his extradition back to Sweden, and he was willing to go, except for the concern that Sweden would turn him over to the United States. As we're about to show you, had Sweden simply agreed, as both Ecuador and Assange's lawyers requested, not to use his presence on Swedish soil as a pretext to then turn him over to the United States to stand trial for national security crimes, had Sweden simply agreed, if you come to Sweden and face these charges, we will not use your presence here to turn you over to the US, Assange would have gotten on the next plane to Sweden in order to face those charges. It was when the Swedish government refused to give those assurances that the Ecuadorians stepped in and said he's clearly in danger in terms of his political rights and his human rights from being turned over to the United States and sent to prison for the rest of his life for the crime of having reported on the United States government. Now, there's, I think, a very good, strong case to make that Julian Assange is definitely one of the most consequential and intrepid journalists of the last, say, 50 years, if not the single most important pioneering journalist of his generation. He has almost certainly broken more major stories than almost every single employee of the mainstream media outlets combined. They don't hate Julian Assange despite the fact that he's broken so many stories. They hate him precisely because of that. In part is because he holds up a mirror showing what they really are. He is what they pretend to be. While the mainstream media constantly publishes stories that they dress up as leaks, but in fact are nothing more than propaganda messaging tasks given to them by the CIA and the FBI and Homeland Security, which pick up the phone and pick their favorite reporter and tell them what to go plant in the newspaper to disseminate propaganda to the American people. Assange never does that. It never has and never would. He shows the American people and the world the secrets the CIA and the FBI and the Pentagon and Homeland Security don't want you to see. And that's why those agencies hate him, and that's why the employees in the media outlets that serve those agencies also hate him. That is the reason that he's in prison. Almost every single employee of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, on a daily basis, you can pick up those newspapers, or if you have the misfortune to listen to those networks, you will hear or read them saying, anonymous officials told us X, Y, and Z. They publish classified information all the time. But they don't end up like Julian Assange or like Jack Teixeira. the 21-year-old member of the Massachusetts National Guard who was hunted this week by the New York Times and the Washington Post and then arrested yesterday by the FBI because he is accused of having leaked classified documents. The difference between the mainstream media on the one hand and Assange and Jack Teixeira and people like Edward Snowden on the other is that the mainstream media publishes leaks that are authorized, that the U.S. security state wants you to see because they're forms of propaganda. And that's why they're never punished. That's why they don't end up in prison. They get book deals, they get put on television, and they're applauded by the U.S. government. The people who end up in prison are those who show you the secrets they want to hide. That's the main difference. It's the difference between being a propagandist and being a journalist. Julian Assange is a journalist, and that's the reason he's in prison. Now, one of the things that really struck me this week about this new leaker, this 21-year-old, is that it follows the same pattern that is always used whenever we have an unauthorized leak, meaning a leak the U.S. security state did not plant themselves. You can go down and look at how Edward Snowden was treated, how Julian Assange is being treated, even how Daniel Ellsberg was treated, or Chelsea Manning. You see exactly the same pattern in the way their media servants behave. So one of the things that is being done, arguably the leading tactic that's being used to malign and demean this newest leaker, is to try to do everything possible to distract your attention away from the substance of the documents that he allegedly enabled us to see. And while there are some documents that made their way onto the internet that I myself would not have published because they don't seem to be in the public interest, many of them are clearly in the public interest. We devoted our show on Monday and again last night to examining some of those documents, including the fact that Joe Biden ordered American special forces to be deployed on the ground to Ukraine. So whether you're in favor of this war in Ukraine or not, whether you're in favor of the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine or not, the government and the media has hidden from you the rather important fact that the United States actually has troops or special forces on the ground participating in a hot war with Russia. Those documents revealed that the United States and Zelensky both believe and have the position that there will be no negotiating, let alone a diplomatic resolution, into 2023, which means they expect and want the war to extend at least through 2024. That's tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars or more that you're going to be told you have to send to Kiev and to Zelensky. Of course, that's something we ought to know. There are documents that say that as a result of spying on Zelensky, the U.S. government knows that he intends to use the weapons he's obtained from NATO and from the U.S. to strike deep into Russian territory, even though we were told repeatedly that U.S. weapons would never be used to strike Russian territory, only to defend Ukraine, given the very serious risk that that can spiral into escalation. And if you want to see all the other things these documents revealed in the public interest that we as Americans ought to know, because they reveal things that our government is doing in secret or reveal lies that they told about what they're doing, you can watch our show on Monday, you can watch our show last night, or you can, for those of you who are local subscribers to our locals community, look at the article we published. It's actually available. We made it available to everyone. It's not behind any paywall, so anyone can look at it, where we've been compiling the documents that were leaked that we ourselves are reporting on. We want you to be able to see those documents, and we don't believe that we get to see them and you don't. CNN, when they show these documents, they blur them. The New York Times, the Washington Post will talk about them but won't show them. We believe you have every right to see what your government is doing in the dark, and the reason we got to see these is because this 21-year-old decided that they should be seen. But instead of focusing on these critically important revelations, there's instead an attempt to focus on his personality, to distract your attention away from the substance of the revelations and instead get you to hate him or dislike him or think poorly of him, so that you have a negative view of the things that he revealed, and so that your focus is on him as a person and not on the revelations themselves. So here, for example, is a Fortune magazine article. There are countless of these doing the same thing. There you see the headline, quote, alleged Pentagon leaker was a conspiracy theorist who shared racist memes and anti-Semitic ideas. I suppose that is relevant if you are trying to decide whether you like Jack Teixeira or not. I personally have a hard time believing it's uncommon that teenage forums, which is what this was, it was mostly 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds. He was the oldest one. I have a hard time believing it's uncommon that people in these kind of underground gaming communities don't say transgressive things. Oftentimes teenagers or young adults in their early 20s say things not out of malice but out of transgression. But be that as it may, assume if you want that he's racist and anti-Semitic. What does that have to do at all with the revelations that he enabled us to see? Nothing. As a journalist, I'm not interested in whether he's a pure person or a nice person with good political views. It doesn't interest me at all. Why would it? What interests me are the documents. And yet, what the media is doing over and over and over is trying to get you to focus on his personality traits. This is exactly the same thing that was done when we first did the reporting in 2013 based on the documents provided by Edward Snowden that revealed the American government was spying on the American people en masse in violation of the Constitution and the law. It was unconstitutional and illegal infringement of millions of Americans' privacy rights. And a court ultimately ruled that the program we revealed, the NSA indiscriminate domestic spying program, violated the Fourth Amendment and violated the law. And yet instantly, we waited about a week, we did stories for a week, and then at Snowden's insistence, we put him on camera, we interviewed him so that he could step forward and say, you don't have to find me, I'm not hiding. I don't believe I did anything wrong. I believe I owe it to the American people to explain why I've done this. And he went on camera and he said, I began as thinking the same things most people are taught to believe about the US government. He tried to enlist in the army to fight in the Iraq War, but along the way, he became disillusioned when he saw that our government frequently lies to the American people. He explained that he saw that these systems were not being used against foreign threats like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but instead had been turned on the American people indiscriminately. And then he explained the final straw was when he heard James Clapper, the senior national security advisor for the Obama administration, went before the United States Senate and falsely deny that the NSA was spying en masse on millions of American citizens. He had the evidence in his hand proving that James Clapper lied. The government was doing exactly that which he falsely said it wasn't. And so he came to myself and Laura Poitras and handed us this full archive of documents so that we could do the reporting. And yet, as soon as we unveiled him, and we knew this was going to happen, the focus immediately switched to away from what the NSA was doing to, oh, Edward Snowden is a narcissist. He thinks he has the right to decide what should and shouldn't be revealed, digging into his past blog posts in order, again, to get you to distract your attention away from what the substantive revelations were onto Edward Snowden as a person. And I think people have forgotten how aggressively that was the strategy invoked with Julian Assange, to create a climate in which Americans would come to regard him as someone who is untoward, somebody who provoked feelings of discomfort, all in order to personalize the leaks onto Assange and get you to dislike him and therefore not want to pay attention to the leaks. Now, just to show you how far this went, here's an article that was published in 2011, just a few months after WikiLeaks concluded its first real major scoop, the one for which Assange is now being prosecuted, showing war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and the diplomatic cables that revealed US allies around the world are deeply corrupt in the Arab world and elsewhere. We'll show you exactly what WikiLeaks revealed in 2010, how important those revelations were. But here's what the editor-in-chief, the executive editor of the New York Times at the time, Bill Keller, just months after WikiLeaks did this reporting, and remember, the New York Times participated in some of this reporting. They worked with Assange. Look at this paragraph that Bill Keller published that he claims he got from one of his reporters right after he had met with Assange. Quote, he, meaning Assange, was alert but disheveled, like a bag lady walking in off the street, wearing a dingy light-colored sport coat and cargo pants, dirty white shirt, beat-up sneakers, and filthy white socks that collapsed around his ankles. He smelled as if he hadn't bathed in days. Do you see that attempt to get you to think Julian Assange is such a dirty person in every sense of the word, that you should forget about everything that WikiLeaks just revealed about what your government did, all the lies that it told you, just like they're doing with Jack Teixeira now? Here's another similar headline published in Vox in 2019 on the day that Julian Assange was arrested. This is Vox, a website filled with writers who have never broken a major story of any kind, let alone one that requires courage or that consists of standing up to powerful institutions. They should revere Julian Assange. But instead, they're ashamed when they think about him because he shows what they really are. And so this is the kind of headline that they published on the day Assange was arrested in order to get you to focus on Assange the person. Quote, why Ecuador released Julian Assange? Rudeness, spying, and poop. He was the worst house guest. Seriously, the worst. I mean, that is really what they said. It's not just the way what they said, but the tone. It's like an adolescent. He was seriously the worst house guest. Seriously the worst. This is Alex Word. I've never heard of this person. I know for a fact, by virtue of the fact that he works for Vox, that he's never broken a significant story. And yet, he's utilizing the tactic that the establishment uses against anyone who brings incriminating and illuminating evidence to light about what the U.S. security state does. And that is exactly what they did all the time with Assange. Now, I think it's really worth recalling how WikiLeaks came into public prominence, even before that 2010 major series of stories that they did about Iraq and Afghanistan. Because I think this has been somewhat forgotten. I remember very well the first day that I ever heard of Julian Assange. It was when I saw this article in the New York Times on March 17, 2010. At the time I was a journalist for Salon. And this is the first time I had really focused on WikiLeaks. I believe I had heard of them before because they had done some minor leaks. But this is the time I really focused on them. So this is an article entitled "Pentagon Sees a Threat from Online Muckrakers." And it's an article describing how the U.S. Army had prepared a report declaring WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state and plotting ways to destroy them. Here's what the New York Times reported, quote, to the list of the enemies threatening the security of the United States, the Pentagon has added WikiLeaks.org, a tiny online source of information and documents that governments and corporations around the world would prefer to keep secret. The Pentagon assessed the danger WikiLeaks.org posed to the Army in a report marked, quote, unauthorized disclosure subject to criminal sanctions. It concluded that, quote, WikiLeaks.org represents a potential force protection, counterintelligence, OPSEC, and InfoSec threat to the U.S. Army, or, in plain English, a threat to Army operations and information. WikiLeaks, true to its mission, to publish materials that expose secrets of all kind, published the 2008 Pentagon report about itself on Monday. So in other words, the U.S. Army published a secret report declaring WikiLeaks an enemy of the state and plotting ways to destroy it, including by submitting fabricated or fake documents to WikiLeaks in the hope that they would publish it and destroy their own credibility. WikiLeaks got a hold of that U.S. Army report and published it on their own website. And then the New York Times did this write-up. The New York Times went on, quote, WikiLeaks, a nonprofit organization, has rankled governments and companies around the world with its publication of materials intended to be kept secret. For instance, the Army's report says that in 2008, access to the website in the United States was cut off by court order after Bank Julius Baer, a Swiss financial institution, sued WikiLeaks for publishing documents implicating Baer in money laundering, grand larceny, and tax evasion. Access was restored after 2 weeks when the bank dropped its case. Governments, including those of North Korea and Thailand, also have tried to prevent access to the WikiLeaks site and complained about its release of materials critical of their governments and policies. The Army's interest in WikiLeaks appears to have been spurred by, among other things, its publication and analysis of classified and unclassified Army documents containing information about military equipment, units, operation, and, quote, nearly the entire order of battle for American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan in April 2007. So before WikiLeaks did its major story, the one based on the archive provided by Chelsea Manning, it had been going around the world exposing corporate corruption, toxic waste dumping in Kenya, money laundering in a Swiss bank, and the Swiss banker actually sued WikiLeaks and got their website shut down for 2 weeks, as well as other acts that the United States government was doing in both Iraq and Afghanistan, to the point where even before those major leaks before WikiLeaks came on the radar of everybody, the Army had declared them to be an enemy of the state and plotted ways to destroy their reputation. Now, one of the things that WikiLeaks did after all of that was in 2010, they did get this archive from Chelsea Manning. That was the thing that really put them on the map, that made the entire US security state devoted to their destruction. Here is, for example, an article that I wrote in March of 2010. So this is actually, just to correct this timing, this is an article that I wrote after the New York Times published that US Army, the article about the US Army report, when the US Army was already planning to destroy WikiLeaks. And I wrote about it just based on that. I actually called Julian Assange the day I saw that New York Times article. I interviewed him for Salon because I knew that the model he had created all the way back then was going to be pioneering in journalism. The model that he created was designed to allow sources around the world to furnish large amounts of digital information that institutions of power wanted to keep secret. This was the genius of Julian Assange. This is why he became so dangerous. Julian Assange realized before anyone else did that the future of journalism in the digital age was going to be large-scale digital leaks. And in order to facilitate that, he needed to provide a way for sources, people inside these institutions, to provide these leaks securely and safely. And so what he did, using his skills as a computer programmer, was create a submission program that guaranteed anonymity to those providing this information. That's what made him so threatening. When Daniel Ellsberg published the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which was tens of thousands of top secret documents that showed that the United States government was systematically lying to the American people about the war in Vietnam, one of the main problems Ellsberg faced back in 1971 was a logistical problem. If you want to leak tens of thousands of pages to a newspaper, how do you even copy it? Do you go to the local drugstore and carry a huge suitcase of dimes and just one after the next at the Xerox machine in the pharmacy, copy page after page after page after page? That is similar to what Ellsberg ended up doing. But in the digital age, everything changed. It became extremely easy for someone inside of an institution like an Edward Snowden or a Chelsea Manning or a Jack Teixeira to take information very quickly by downloading it and then sending it to journalists in order to publish it, in order to curate it, in order to report on it. And Assange's genius, his pioneering prescient anticipation and recognition, was that all that you needed to do was to create a safe way for sources to do that, and they would come to you, and that's what he created. He was able to hold all kinds of corporate and state institutions accountable before that big leak even happened. And that's what caused me to interview him and write about him in 2010. And the headline that I used at Salon when I first wrote about WikiLeaks the first time was, quote, "The War on WikiLeaks and Why It Matters." And there you see the subheadline: the US government escalates its campaign to harass and destroy a key whistleblowing site. So this war between Assange and the US government has been long in the making, well before people even had heard of WikiLeaks. Now, The first leak that I ever wrote about back then is a really fascinating one. It's been lost to memory and it's been lost to history. This was, again, before the collateral murder video and all of the things that he ended up showing. It was a CIA red cell letter that was in March of 2010. And our CIA red cell letter is a way that the CIA recognizes a certain problem in the world that's emerging and thinks about how they can try and solve it. And the problem that this CIA red cell letter was anticipating and discussing, and it's one that WikiLeaks obtained and leaked, is really fascinating. They were very worried that the war in Afghanistan was becoming increasingly unpopular. Listen to this. People in Western Europe started to wonder, why are we fighting a war in Afghanistan for 9 years now? Why are we sending our sons and daughters to go fight and die in Afghanistan against the Taliban? How does this make any sense? Why are we spending billions of dollars on a war in Afghanistan when our standard of living is plummeting at home? And there had been two governments, one in the Netherlands and another one, that had collapsed, had fallen in parliamentary elections, largely due to the popular anger that those governments wanted to keep fighting in the war in Afghanistan. And the CIA was petrified that if this continued, if anti-war sentiment about the war in Afghanistan continued to spread throughout Western Europe, every government that was for the war would lose, or they would be forced to pull troops out. In other words, they would be forced to adhere to the wishes of the population, and you can't have that. So this CIA letter was to say, how are we going to fix this problem? And here you see this fascinating title of the CIA memo. And again, this is the only reason we know about this is because WikiLeaks published it, where they say Afghanistan, sustaining Western European support for the NATO-led mission, why counting on apathy might not be enough. That's an incredibly revealing phrase. The CIA knows that nobody was waking up in Western Europe or in the United States in 2010 and wanting the government to send people to die and spend resources on the war in Afghanistan. What they count on instead is apathy. They go and they fight their wars in Syria and Libya, in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and they know it doesn't improve your life. They know that that's not what you want. But what they count on is your apathy. That at some point you just kind of give up, you say, I can't do anything about it, this war is going to go on for as long as they want it to, and there's not much I can do. That's apathy. And the CIA is saying, usually we count on apathy, that's how we get our way. That's how we're able to do things against the will of the population. But in this case, apathy may not be enough because anti-war sentiment is spreading throughout Western Europe. And so their solution was to make Barack Obama the face of the war in Afghanistan, because they knew that Western Europeans adored Barack Obama. They saw that Barack Obama was a tool of theirs, a marketing tool, to take this war that was started by George Bush, whom Western Europeans looked at with disapproval. He was a swaggering American, an evangelical, religious Christian, something not popular among Western Europe, and they replaced that face with a much more cosmopolitan, progressive face of Barack Obama. And the CIA knew that if they could make Barack Obama the face of that war and give it a progressive rationale, they would stem the tide of anti-war sentiment in Western Europe and enable that war to continue, and that's exactly what happened. So here in this memo, the CIA says, appeals by President Obama and Afghan women may gain traction. That's the, let me bring that up. That's the headline there of what the CIA is saying. So they knew that appeals by President Obama and using Afghan women would make Western Europeans agree to have this war continue. Quote, the confidence of the French and German publics in President Obama's ability to handle foreign affairs in general and Afghanistan in particular suggests that they would be receptive to his direct affirmation of their importance to the ISAF mission and sensitive to direct expressions of disappointment and allies who do not help. Isn't that fascinating? The CIA knew that Obama was a marketing tool for their wars, and that's what he became, and that worked. Western Europe stayed with the United States until the United States left in Afghanistan. Now, that is the kind of thing that WikiLeaks is publishing, and that's why the US security state decided they had to destroy Julian Assange, with things like having Bill Keller go and say his socks were filthy, he didn't take a bath. But then the big leak was the one that Chelsea Manning enabled in 2010, that no matter what your views on the wars, those wars were in Afghanistan and Iraq and the war on terror, unquestionably we ought to have seen these things that WikiLeaks enabled us to see. This is the reporting in 2010, not what Julian Assange did in 2016 in the election, but this reporting is what he's being prosecuted for. So I could spend all night showing you what that reporting revealed, but just to give you a couple of samples, here from November of 2010, there are documents that Hillary Clinton ordered American diplomats to spy on UN officials. You think Hillary Clinton, who at the time was the Secretary of State, was appreciative that she got caught spying on UN officials? Here from The Guardian, you see the Iraq war logs, secret order that led the US to ignore abuse. There was an order in place where the United States government knew that Iraqi security forces, which we were arming and training, were using torture and murder against dissidents to the regime we installed. And there was an order in place telling American troops they were to ignore that and overlook it and not doing anything about it. And then, of course, there was the most famous part of all, which was the video that WikiLeaks published showing American troops gunning down 12 innocent people, including 2 Reuters journalists, killing them all as they tried to crawl away, and then shooting on the people who came and rescued them, ambulance workers and the like as well. Let's take just a look at just a small portion of that video to remind you how Julian Assange became an enemy of the state to the point where he's in prison 13 years later.
All right, firing.
Line here, when the state line out.
Let me know when you have it.
We'll shoot. Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260s.
Come on, fire.
Hey, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot.
Bushmaster 2-6, Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now.
All right, we just engaged all 8 individuals.
Yeah, we got 2 birds. We're still firing.
Roger.
Got him.
6 is a 2-6. We'll move, but we got
Oh, fuck, sorry. Well, it's done.
bypass.
God damn it, Kyle.
All right.
Where's that van at?
Right down there by the body.
Okay, yeah.
Bushmaster, Crazy Horse, we have individuals going to the scene. Looks like possibly picking up bodies and weapons.
No, I don't think people are particularly surprised that wars entail the killing of innocent civilians, even sometimes what seemed to be deliberate, and you hear the troops kind of celebrating it. But images are very powerful, and we should know what our government is doing in our name. We constantly see the victims in Ukraine so that our emotions are worked up to hate Russia and to be disgusted by the Russian war. But all the reporting that WikiLeaks did in 2010 as part of that reporting on Hillary Clinton, on the Clinton State Department, on the Obama administration, on what we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, what our allies around the world were doing, were all incredibly newsworthy. As I said, they were more significant and huge scoops than the work of almost every employee of media outlets combined. And it was at that point that our government decided that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks had to be destroyed at any cost, because he was too dangerous. And the reason he was too dangerous is that unlike the people who are working in the New York Times and the Washington Post and NBC and CNN, who do the US security state's bidding, who are little more than glorified messengers for the US security state, Julian Assange was doing real journalism. And that is what we can't have. You can have all the guarantees in the Constitution that you want about a free press, but it's just words on parchment paper if we allow the government to then go and imprison those who do real reporting, and it's always with the aid of media outlets who destroy his reputation with the kind of stuff that I showed you. Now, That is basically part one of the first half of what really happened with Julian Assange. That is what led to the determination of the United States government to destroy him. I think that part of the story is extremely significant. We're going to show you part two, which is... Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.